Okay, there we go. Much better. So I'm going to talk to you guys about a subject that's been very interesting for me. Having spent a lot of time, obviously, with Western development from my original experience at Activision, coming to wargaming, a year ago, it's been an opportunity for me. When I came here, I thought what I was going to learn a lot about was free-to-play. It was a new model for me. It was different. I'd been used to big box product, traditional retail, and things like that. And instead, I think one of the things that's been maybe the most interesting learning for me has actually been this thing that I'm going to talk about now, which is learning not so much a new business model as actually a new culture and methodology and process. So I've titled this, as you can see, Lessons I've Learned So Far, because frankly, this is really only the start of things, and I'm sure that if I give the same presentation 5 years from now, 10 years from now, I'll probably have much more deep and detailed learnings and experiences around this as well. But I think this is a good sort of a start to be able to see some of the differences that I've come to see so far, and what I think the strengths of each are that we can try to blend. And that, I think, again, before I get in, that's something that I think is a really unique advantage we have at wargaming, the fact that we really are this multicultural, multi-territorial entity that has an opportunity to learn these lessons and for each side to help inform and make the other better. There's not a lot of other publishers, frankly, that have this going the way that we do. So I'm excited about that. Now, I'll start actually with a little story. This is kind of the inciting incident, if you will, the thing that made me really start thinking about this as a topic. It was fairly early on. I think it was probably August when this happened, prior to the full World of Warships launch. I think it was around the time of one of the green lights for warships, and we were talking to some of the folks, I believe, in Cyprus, and talking about what the relative success of tanks had been and what they thought warships was going to do, specifically in North America. Obviously, World of Tanks is huge here, right? It's the national pastime practically. It's the game everybody plays, and for good reason. I mean, it's an amazing game, but it's also got this really clear sort of cultural touchstone to it. In North America, it's growing, but it's still definitely much smaller overall. And there was a theory that was expressed by some of the folks that warships would actually do a lot better in North America because their view was, well, and you can see the quote here, North America is more of a naval culture than a tank culture. And that it just didn't sit quite right in my head. It didn't really resonate for me as a North American that would be the difference. So it got me started thinking, what is it? Is it ships versus tanks, or is it really actually something else? So statues kind of tell a story here. While I was in Minsk, many of you may recognize this, right? The T-34, which, as some people have been noted for me, may or may not in fact be a T-34-85 turret, but T-34 statue, right, in the heart of Belarus. I remember being taken to this by some friends in the Minsk studio on one of my first trips and actually seeing this in person. And on the other side, what you have is the U.S. Marine Corps Memorial, more popularly known as the Iwo Jima Memorial, which is in Washington, D.C. And this is, I think it's a really telling thing here, that there's a difference in what is celebrated culturally. What you've got on the left here is a celebration in a lot of ways of the tool of the battle, of what was used as an unbelievably effective weapon, right, in the war. And on the other side, you've got what, frankly, to Americans is also viewed as the unbelievably effective weapon in the war. But it's not about, is it ships or tanks? It's actually a bigger thing. It's technology versus people. the North American, sort of the American spirit, the idea is that, that we value, we believe in the individual and the individual's ability to make a difference and to be the deciding force on the battlefield through, phrases like Yankee ingenuity or American spirit or these kinds of statements. And again, that's not to say that there's not a belief or a respect or value on the people in a more Eastern culture, but I think it's a slightly different appreciation. The technology is in a lot of ways the embodiment of what the people as a collective have managed to do, right? Managed to create, and that there's a source of the pride there. I mean, even if you look like at say one of the living museums, the battleships, in U.S. naval yards, when you go into the ship, there's picture after picture after picture of the crew on the ship, the individuals again, showing what they did, how they lived their life there, the differences they made, how they used the ship. It's more that the technology enabled the people rather than sort of the other way around. And I think this is actually, for me, with my own, background with Call of Duty, this has been really enlightening because in a lot of ways I've realized that the game that I've been working on and, helping to build and make and all that, in the early days, Call of Duty, it's frankly World of Soldiers when you come right down to it. So again, tech versus people. So it's these non-obvious differences, where we think we're talking about something smaller, and it turns out it's actually something where we don't even think about what the difference is or where that came from. And again, that's kind of what got me going on this topic and started me really getting into it as a subject matter to think more about. A lot of this really, it comes from upbringing. Now, the later we go, and the more that the world shrinks because of the internet and the similarity of information that we're exposed to over time, the more similar you're seeing the culture's starting to get. But there are some big differences even now. One of the big ones is there's a massive difference, I think, in the perceived value or the importance placed, even at the level of for kids, of what is now being referred to in a lot of popular media as STEM, science, technology, engineering, math. In the U.S., this is the level of STEM proficiency for high schoolers is dropping at an alarming rate. We seem to be pumping out people with business degrees, Masters of Business Administration, who will be able to manage companies at an unbelievable rate. Virtually infinite number of those folks seem to be coming out of U.S. schools every year. So they'll all be able to manage businesses. Now, what these businesses will be making, I have no idea if we don't have any actual technologists to create anything. But this is kind of, this is a relative weighting. And, if you look in our own company, right, in wargaming, there's sort of great evidence of the importance of this as you look at guys like Serb, Slava, Victor himself, who all come from these really hardcore science backgrounds. I think there's much more of an appreciation of the tech side here than there is in the West right now. Now, what that leads to is more of an objective view of sort of, scientists tend to look at the world through more of an objective right and wrong, rather than there being a lot of sort of gray area, different quality of answers. It's more sort of a one or the other. Math is a very binary thing. You either have the right answer or you don't. So that also leads to it's sort of more data-driven, there's more precision involved, but this data gathering and analysis and so on, it can be a little bit slower, right? So when I say deliberate, I mean, there's more sort of ramp up, there's more pre-work involved before things get going, versus, in Western cultures where things tend to be more, I mean, Chris said it yesterday, well, I love to just, start when I haven't even finished designing everything. And kind of, poof, off he goes. Very different style, right? That is a very typical, even though he's Canadian, that's a very typical American sort of an approach to things that, from the experience I've had working with wargaming, is sort of unthinkable and almost unallowable, right, in the approach that's been prominent here. Another difference, I think, difference in focus on sort of individual comfort versus function and utility. Certainly I think the stereotypical view of your average Westerner or American here tends to be a little bit of sort of, we're indulgent, we're slow, we don't work very hard, we want to have things spoon-fed to us. That's not entirely untrue, really, to be honest, but this focus on comfort, you can see it actually reflected in the way that we approach the UI, right? The user interface for your average game. Look at the console market, it's super, super simplified, right? Things are very spoon-fed, not a lot of buttons on screen at once. It's a very curated sort of an experience versus look at the World of Tanks opening screen and you're in the garage and it's all there. You can do anything. The amount of function and utility in that is massive, but it's sort of an unguided tour. And we're only starting to make changes on that now and move it towards something that's more casually appealing. But there's, again, you can see the differences starting to come through in the results. Other ways on this, going into a little bit of sort of direct comparisons, East and West. Again, if the Eastern, and when I say Eastern, I'm kind of referring to here, right? More hard facts, scientific approach, where the West, it's sort of this belief in the possible, like there's a willing disbelief almost. The facts are really just the facts today, but we can change the facts and make them different for tomorrow. That's kind of a very standard Western style of thought. Again, the analysis before moving, right? Think, don't move till you see it. Let's really analyze everything that we can do first before we start down the road, down the path. Versus, again, Chris, I had great heart when Chris talked about, let's just go. We'll figure it out as we go. Oh, man. I could hear Victor I could hear the nerves in his ear going like this, even as Chris said it. He didn't even know Chris was saying it. It was like a disturbance in the force for him from far away, right? But that's very typical Western approach, right? We really believe that we'll be able to figure it out as we go, as opposed to plan it and don't make mistakes, right? Very different style. It leads to, there's more of a debate and direct argument approach here. One of the things I had to get used to early on was the idea that there's sort of an assumption that, when you first meet somebody, that maybe they don't know what they're talking about is sort of the default, and then you can earn your way towards being, actually you're not. You actually do know what you're doing. The West is more the other way around, and there's a lot more of a focus on, no, you don't argue like that. That's rude, that's not polite. Very different. And it's not that conflict doesn't happen. Believe me, it happens all the time in Western businesses. It's just the way that it happens is a lot more subtle, and you learn to look for these little cue words. Well, that's disappointing. That means something much bigger than, I didn't get exactly the fruit I wanted at dessert. That means it's war. So it's a very different style. The kind of debate, frankly, I really enjoy the sort of the back and forth and the big debate. I think it's one of the reasons I'm really enjoying wargaming is, this part for me I feel much more at home with than what I'm used to, with this more political, kind of careful, sort of approach to things. This, again, what we talked about, this sort of failure is not an option, right? This is why we plan carefully, because we must not, cannot, will not fail from the first. Our plan has to be perfect before we start. Versus, in the U.S., we're going to take chances. We're going to take risks. We're going to go try to win by setting ambitious goals and trying to reach them, and again, being more, changes along the way. And then, to talk about some of the sort of the leadership view on that, in the West, you've got very consensus-driven decision-making. A lot of, okay, do you think we should do this? Do you? Okay, let's vote, right? Versus, if you look, and I love Malik. In a lot of ways, he embodies this, right? It's very clear, in the St. Petersburg studio, Malik's decision is final on these things. Now, and that's not to say that he doesn't take the wise counsel of a lot of people, but there's a very clear leader, and that seems to be more common where, in the West it can be more, again, sort of it's leadership by influence and gathering support rather than, hey, here's what's going on. And in a similar way, look at just the way that Chris and I started talking yesterday, right? We started talking about, here I am telling you stories, right? I'm telling you about, things that I screwed up on as, in the beginning of my career, where I started, what I led to, there's a lot more, we talk about ourselves and our own experiences and our own growth. We're more, I think, public with those things as leads, more willing to be sort of openly vulnerable and admit, hey, that we're not perfect and we can make some mistakes and things like that. That same learning absolutely happens in Eastern leaders, but I think it's more generally private. There's not a, hey, I want to explain to you what I learned and here's how I made mistakes. It's more, yes, absolutely, there's learning, there's understanding, there's growth, but it's not viewed quite as polite to sort of talk about that because you don't want to appear weak. And for us, the view is that vulnerability isn't an admission of weakness. It's actually it's a sign of our growth, of our, of what we're doing and how we're growing and changing. So, and now these again, the danger with culture is that it can be easy to talk about things and sort of move into stereotypes. These are not everybody in the East is this, everybody in the West is this. That's not accurate. There are very Eastern-style Westerners, there are very Western-style Easterners. But if you think about sort of prevailing trends, right? Do you see more of one of these or the other in one of the other cultures? It's a tendency, right, rather than an absolute. And hopefully some of this is things that you're seeing and that you can connect with. And I realize, for me, I've been thinking about this, really trying to understand, the Eastern view, and then as I'm talking to you guys, a lot of what I'm actually communicating is sort of the thing on the right. There's a certain level of the interest for the audience here mostly is how do you deal with the crazy guys like me and Chris that just never stop talking? So, a little bit different. So, we can talk a little about, what I've, again, this is, day 365 of an ongoing project, but what I've seen so far to try to merge the two, kind of take the best of both worlds. I think it is important to seek involvement of stakeholders. I think it is important to gather that information ahead of time. Sit down when you're going to engage in something that's really big, a big change in the studio, for example. If we're going to do some rework of process, things that we're talking about in Minsk. Hey, is the structure we've got perfect? Do we want to restructure in some ways? I don't want to just dump that down on the studio. Here's your new process. Good luck. That's not, to me, that doesn't feel like it's going to work. I'm still going to seek the involvement of each of the individual folks, right? Spend time with each of the senior team to get to that right answer. At the end, it'll still be a single person making a call, right? We're not going to vote. We're going to move forward on things. But I think more of a push for that consensus to understand it and understand all of those issues ahead of time is important. I want to have more of an empowerment of the leads. I don't think this is purely cultural. I think certainly in the Mint studio there's been some individual choices and behaviors about how that team has been treated or approached or things like that have led to some of this. But I want to get back to really having an empowered team of leads with an expectation of solving the problems. That we're going to move rather than worry about what's the risk of the fix, that if we may introduce these new risks, and focus more on what are the problems that we know exist right now, and let's make sure that we fix those. Because, look, if we solve 8 problems and we introduce 2 new ones, I'm still up +6. That's still a net benefit. That's still a win. So I want to do that. I want to push towards that very proactive, very problem-solving. And again, if that means that we're not going to spend data gathering, if we're not going to spend 6 months analyzing whether we should have a blue button or a green button, with a blue ribbon panel of the best people in blue and green button Scientology to figure out what we're going to do and how we're going to do it and all that, before we finally, 6 months later, after peer review and everything else, in a 9,000-page document analyzing every possible pro and con of blue and green buttons, and then eventually we kind of guess and move with what we think is the right answer. I'd like to move to the approach of, hey, week 1, it's a blue button. Week 2, It's a green button. Week 3, we go with whichever one it is that tested better over the course of that last week. Boom, done, right? So I want to tie the data gathering that we do to the risk of the feature development and the amount of time it's going to take and the amount of time it would take to revert it. Look, if we're going to change fundamental engine technologies, I'm going to go east on that, right? Like we're going to analyze the hell out of that because you can really screw things up because that's a core issue. But if it's something that's more surface that we can be a little bit more quickly experimental on and go with that kind of rapid prototyping, we'll figure it out as we go, then I want to go that way, right? So, tying that kind of which style, something that's rational and clear and easy to understand, how long will it take to build, I think is a good way to kind of get some of the best of both worlds. Another thing that I've been seeing here is, we need to get good at acknowledging the differences in regional and territorial tastes. There are very different things to what can make for a successful game here versus in North America, which is even different versus Europe, which is even different versus the Asia office, right? All these different areas. And even, it's funny that we talk about Asia as the Asia office. The individual cultures inside of Asia are all very, very, very different as well. So learning those things and getting to see where those differences are and getting better at adapting our games towards those individual areas, I think it's an important thing for us to be able to do. And that probably means moving towards more of these things being data-driven rather than hard-coded so that then we can make changes without having to go through massive QA cycles and maintaining really entirely different games over and over again and treating it more like we treat a language localization. So, those are, I think, some of the sort of quick versions, ideas that I've been able to see so far as how to blend the things. As I said, give me 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, I think I'll have a much deeper list. But this is sort of where I'm starting. And I think as a closing statement, why is this something worth doing? Why is this something that I got really excited about or interested in? Embracing these differences always leads to better outcomes. There's no idea in the history of ideas that's ever gotten better by just being exposed to the same viewpoint. This is true in cultures. This is true with departments. Again, even when I talk about Western, I saw examples of this even when I was working with Bungie, and we had a team that was based in near Liverpool, the northern part of the United Kingdom, working on the PlayStation 3 version of Destiny, doing a lot of the PS3 code and having to integrate. There were massive cultural differences just between the UK office and the US office that we had to kind of overcome in order to be able to make that successful. And looking for those differences, being aware of them, mindful of them, and sort of getting to the root cause is really important, because if you don't, it just ends up being two groups that just talk past each other, right? That argue a lot and don't seem to understand why the other person doesn't see it. Why are they being so stupid? Why don't they this is obvious. Any time that you think something's obvious and the other person isn't getting it, there's a really good chance that's a cultural bias. There's a really, really good chance. When it's so obvious to you that it's just breathing, that it's air, that's probably more of a cultural thing than it is a sort of a rational choice, because those are the things that we just internalize and accept as natural truths, right? But yeah, do this with West and East, sure. Do this with even different groups. Frankly, there are different inside of your own studio. I'm sure that, frankly, that the alpha team, right, may have a slightly different sort of culture and approach to things than the Bravo team might have, and so on. Look for those. And then, frankly, I think the last thing I'll say before I move to sort of Q&A on this is look for that. Try to seek out and embrace those things with the people whose jobs are the most sort of reverse to yours. Meaning, if we're the developers, let's, seek out the publishing side, the marketing expertise and the PR expertise and operations and regional teams and so on. The reason that they're taking a very different approach on things isn't because they want to screw up your game. right? They're not there to destroy your game and sell less of it. They don't make any more money by selling less of it than, none of us benefit by having it fail, right? We all succeed or fail together. So the reason that they have a different view is because they have a different set of perceptions going in and a different set of things that they think are important. Embracing those differences and understanding them, really taking the time to understand them, tends to lead to a much better result. It's certainly, I think, in a lot of ways, the biggest secret to the success for Call of Duty. It wasn't just that we built a really good game. There's a lot of, frankly, better Metacritic-rated games out there that didn't sell as well. But I think what we've done a better job of on those, in a lot of ways, was really taking on board the feedback to be able to make it something that appealed to a wider group of people and allowed the marketing and PR teams and so on to do their jobs, to be involved, to be bought in, to be part of it, and therefore to be able to be really passionate and go out and do their jobs well. So I'd look for that in every way that you can. Just, if I can leave that as sort of parting advice for now. So I wanted to be simple. I didn't want to have a whole bunch of slides. That's what I've got. If there are questions, I'd love to talk about that.
Thank you very much, Thane. It was very, very educational. Thank you. It was polite and direct, so we are moving on to questions, please.
Hi, do you have any funny stories about localization issues that spawned from cultural differences?
Yeah, well, there's the obvious ones, right, which is that, if you're going to localize into German, you need to build about 3 times the amount of real estate into it that you thought, because everything in German, somehow, in German, the words, it's like dragon is a word, red dragon is just the 2 words put together, red dragon that farts on Wednesdays while watching episodes of Friends is 1 word that just is the super word. So there's the obvious space stuff, but there are certainly, I'll give you an example, actually, that's not from my own personal experience, but that was a great one for an auto manufacturer, famous auto manufacturer. Chevy made a car called the Nova. Very proud of that name. Great name. Good, does really well in America. And Chevy is one of those traditional U.S., like all their ads are the American flag waving while a car drives by kind of stuff, right? The Nova sounds like a really great name because, supernova, it implies power and all that. So it turns out in Spanish, nova means does not go. Not the best, maybe, car name. You'll see things like that all the time, little stuff that can happen. I think that one to me is that's the one that I like to sort of keep on my, in my mental billboard if I'm dealing with lokes. Again, whenever I'm getting a really hardcore, like, no, you have to change this, and I don't understand what the problem is, it's probably a Nova.
Thank you very much. Could you think that is it possible or maybe acceptable or maybe must have to create some difference in one game to develop different version for different regions?
Yeah, there's a technical issue, right? Like if we really create things that are entirely different, then, our QA team's going to want to shoot themselves, right? Because it has to be, 12 times as big because now we're actually shipping 6 different games, right? So there's a real downside. If we go too far, if we embrace this too deeply and are too careful, we actually end up in a place that from a business standpoint and a logistical and shipping standpoint is impractical. So the way that I like to try to think about that, again, is as much as possible when there is something that could be a cultural difference, an opportunity for a localization, think of it not just as a word change localization, right, but as a cultural change, a culturalization of the build. Wherever we can find those things, let's try to expose those as data-driven things so that, again, we can, we do a short review, right? It's a one-day QA sweep instead of an actual code change that's a whole, redo of the whole thing. But I do think the more that we tailor to individual territories, the more we will see financial upside in the individual territories. But it's a balance, right? Yes.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I just wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit more about the things you said about Call of Duty. What do you think you've done there very right that everyone should have done in their other games? Are there some kind of concrete examples about that?
Sure. So that's a big topic. I could have probably sat here and just talked about Call of Duty for a while, and probably some people would have been happy with that. I think there are, it's been really fun for me to actually be in a position where for the second time I get to work on a hardcore action World War II kind of a shooter, right? I mean, World of Tanks is still a shooter at its core, at least an action combat game, if you will. Not many people get the chance, you say, oh, if I had it to do over again, I would. Not many people actually ever get that chance. I actually am getting that chance in a lot of ways, which is great. I think, things that I've seen early on Call of Duty, we were really pushing hard on realism. And we came to realize that more important than realism even is actually the way we started talking about it in our own studios and with each other was authenticity, perceived realism. There are things that may actually be realistic that don't feel right to your average player, that don't register as being true, even though technically speaking they are. And moving towards embracing the idea that what we want to go for is perceived reality or authenticity is actually probably the best way to go. Just this morning at breakfast we were talking about this. Gun sounds. If you use real, actual 100% true weapon gunfire, it doesn't actually sound all that impressive, right? Pop, 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 pop. It sounds like firecrackers going off. On the other hand, play a Call of Duty game, and every time you fire the weapon, the only way you'd get that level of noise is if you were actually inside the chamber, right? In the barrel itself of the gun as it's firing. I mean, it's boom, boom, Everything's like you're firing cannons, even if you're just, firing a pistol. But it creates that intensity and that perception in players that this is totally real. No, it's nowhere near real. It's Hollywood real, which is to say not real at all. But it feels real to that player. I think that's an important thing. In a similar sort of a related thing, I think embracing the fact that fun is the most important thing rather than real. I mean, we could, if we wanted to, create a far more realistic version of our game where on every desert level, a third of the tank's engines conked out because they got sand in them. It'd be realistic. I'm not sure it would fall high on the fun scale, right? So, I think those are, to me, a lot of the things that I could take from Call of Duty, at least as surface level stuff, is embracing those things, right? Worry about fun, worry about perceived realism, about pleasing the audience first. And if that means that we have to shave a little bit off of reality, I mean, I'm not saying, to serve, no fucking pink ponies, as he says, right? I'm not talking we put in Mario stars bouncing around the level, right? But again, focus on perceived reality as maybe the, the hallmark that we strive for.
Next
Yes.
question.
Hello, thanks for your talk. And I'd like to ask, you probably heard about development culture in the company called Valve. And
Yeah.
I'd like to ask, what do you think about it? Is it pure Western culture, or is it viewed like they're strange, maybe? And do you think we can use something, we can learn something from them and adapt in our company or in East generally?
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, look, every company worldwide could learn something from Valve, which is start with $1 billion and then make just good, nothing but perfect calls, right? Like take all the time in the world. Valve is an interesting one, So one of the first games I worked on at Activision actually was called Vampire the Masquerade. If you guys know that, it's a paper and pencil RPG series. The game was called Bloodlines. It was, I'm sort of proud of this, it was in fact the first game to code release using the Half-Life 2 engine, using the source tech, before Half-Life 2. Like we actually finished before they did. And there's interesting stories around that I can probably more share when there's no cameras and we're over drinks. But the thing that I saw from Valve is Blizzard has some of this too, right? They're incredibly religious about quality. That's their biggest thing, right? They will delay, they will hold, they will stop, they will put things off. I mean, geez, Half-Life 3 is, what, 15 years overdue at this point? You know, there's a willingness from their side to absolutely realize that the value of their brand, and Blizzard, you know, Wyatt's here, he can tell you the truth, the real truth of this, but that the value of their brand is that, you know, it is one of the few names in the business that really is synonymous with quality, right? And that you only get one shot at having that happen. And the minute you start releasing something that's not a 90+ rated Metacritic, whatever, then, you know, that fades, and it fades really fast. So being stubborn about quality, being dogged about that is really important. We don't all have the luxury, right, of being able to just say, well, it's fine, you know, screw it, we'll wait for 3 years. Because, you know, the business has to continue, right? So I think for us what that means is that we have to all hold ourselves to a higher standard where we have to both ship something great and realize that, as an old friend of mine from Activision used to describe it, the 11 o'clock news comes on at 11 o'clock, right? I used to say kind of the same thing in a different way. I'd tell the guys, you know, like, look, guys, I know it's hard. We could probably use another couple of months. And look, if I could call Santa and move Christmas, I totally would. We don't have the luxury. So, you know, being willing to really hold ourselves about quality early and make decisions and make those changes. I think this, you know, back to the Western mentality a little bit, but if the plan that we're on isn't getting us to great, as soon as we see that, time for a new plan, right? Change, adapt, move. Don't be dogged about sticking to what we thought, because if what we're going to get to isn't actually worth shipping, then it's not worth working on. It's a waste of time. So, you know, holding ourselves to that, I think, is something that we can take from Valve, from Blizzard, from others.
Alexander?
Hello again. First, I would like to thank you for your awesome comparison with Western and Eastern culture, or business culture, or corporate culture. The question is, I didn't actually know I don't actually very well your previous background, but probably there's your either experience or assumption. What about Far East corporate culture? Is it, I mean, Japanese, Chinese, is it, according to your, you know, at least opinion, is it a variant of Eastern culture, or is it the third other world which has nothing in common with the first two ones you were talking about? Yep. Or are we, as Eastern corporate culture, close to them also in your Silicon Valley point of view?
Sure.
Thank you.
It's a great question. I'll give you just the really quick version of me. Hey, I get to talk about me. How cool is that? Chris, not bad, huh? So just really quick version of me. I was 17 years at Activision before I came to Wargaming a year ago. I was the senior producer on Call of Duty 1, EP on Call of Duty 2 and the console game, and so on through about 3, and I was VP of production on the Call of Duties through Black Ops 2, and then on Destiny. Those would be the biggest things that I've worked on at kind of and at a franchise level. So everything Call of Duty for that period of time I was dealing with. There were a bunch of other things I worked on during that time as well at Activision, smaller things. As you know, as I got sort of higher in the organization, I worked on a bunch of licensed product, a few Transformers games. I worked for quite a while with a group in Vancouver on a true crime game that never actually ended up shipping as a true crime game. When Activision made some choices about shrinking its slate and only focusing on like the 3 big things, Skylanders, Call of Duty, Destiny, we sold that to Square Enix. It ended up shipping as Sleeping Dogs. So I've worked on a lot of Western-style retail, box product retail, but with a very heavy live games as a service sort of an approach. COD and Destiny are very similar to World of Tanks in that way. But it's all been, you know, all my previous stuff has been really retail model, right? Pay and go. So that's the stuff that I've worked on. and that'll help inform sort of what I can say about the eastern side, the far east eastern side, the really east side. I had some exposure there. I took a trip actually sort of midway through, around a little after Modern Warfare 1, had a pretty good sort of dive on the idea of doing a free-to-play Call of Duty in Korea, because that actually at that time was sort of the big market. China was really closed, like you just couldn't ship there, so it wasn't really an option. So we were focused in on working with a Korean publisher and having a lot of that discussion. There are significant differences between that business culture and either of the other ones, either here or the West. There's a huge focus on politeness. There are far more things that you can't say there. And frankly, even when I talk about the Western, like, well, you got to be subtle. It's even deeper, I think, when you're dealing with sort of the Asian groups a lot. But I think there is a huge focus on STEM again. I mean, if you look, the rates, the STEM proficiency rates, science, tech, engineering, math, in a place like Singapore, I mean, I believe the last figure I saw was something like 76% proficiency when you graduate high school, or the high school equivalent, where in the US it's like, God, it's something embarrassing, like 12%. So, massive difference in that valuation of a hardcore science. So that's a piece I've seen. Beyond that, gameplay is really interesting. With Call of Duty, we had this hubris, right? This pride. Oh, look at those horrible looking games. Crossfire, yeah, sure, maybe it's fun, but it looks abysmal. Oh, graphically, Call of Duty's so much better, we'll kill it. And we got in there and we started talking to the publishers. And again, like it was ships versus tanks as opposed to tech versus people. They were like, hey, can you cut some of the frames of animation out? Like, we like things faster. This thing you've got with the reload, like, that takes like 1,000,000 years. You're looking, you're like, it's a quarter of a second. Oh my God. But it's, oh, that's forever. This is intolerable. Chop frames out of the animation. We don't care about the visuals as much. We want it faster, faster, faster. Can you shrink the maps? Can you move in the spawn points? I mean, it's a hyper fast gameplay style that was preferred there. And so it's actually funny for me, because then I think about, what Call of Duty is versus World of Tanks in terms of pacing, and then I think about what they wanted from Call of Duty. And you can see where there's not necessarily a natural fit. Like, it goes beyond just, should we have anime characters with big eyes maybe in World of Tanks? Do we actually need to, if we really want to break into that market, do we actually need to really make it a faster, more Twitch game, which is a totally different game than what we're used to building. Beyond that, I think, beyond that, those things that I can tell you, I don't have a lot of the cultural touchstone. I didn't work with a lot of Far East developers, so a lot of what I'm able to talk about is secondhand through friends of mine who actually were spending tons of time there and working through that. But I think what I know is just enough to know that I don't know a lot, and that it is definitely, these lessons are not valid there. There's a whole separate set of learnings to do. And I will say, for me, it's not like I'm some kind of cultural anthropologist. It's not like I'm some scientist that's figured all this out because I have special training, right? I'm just a guy who is sort of interested and, inquisitive enough about it and found something early on that kind of got my brain, noodling on this problem, and then started looking for the answers. And I'm sure that probably any of you in the audience could have done this if you had, in fact, over the last year logged, 100,000 frequent flyer miles and, and sort of sat between the two offices the way that I had been. So, for me, it's fun because I feel like I've had the benefit of getting that learning via sort of Wargaming University, and so that's part of the reason I'm excited to be able to share it with all of you. But I think everybody's going to start seeing and doing this a lot more. I mean, this kind of cross-cultural development, it's now becoming the norm, right? I mean, we all know for years, we've been doing outsourcing, which is working with a different studio on something, right? And now as we do distributed development, we're doing it more and more and more, right? I mean, look at any Ubisoft game, for example. Look at the credits. And it's, this part was made in Shanghai, and this part was made in Paris, and this part was made in Montreal, and here's this other part that was made in, in some other office that they just opened for that one. I mean, Assassin's Creed credits they're great because you can see, like, not only does the name of the studio change, but then, like, the last names all go to a certain style for a little while and then stop, and then go to another set and stop. And, but this is going to be, within the next 5 to 10 years, we're all doing it. Like, this is just going to be normal, that we will be developing games globally rather than at one studio in one region just doing one thing. So I think it'll be important for all of us to be able and willing to look through those and have that inquisitive approach to the differences here.
Thank you very much, Thane. That was amazing, let me say so. We have time for one more question.
Hi, Thane. Thank you for a comprehensive analysis. This is especially valuable because we all can do the same analysis being an Eastern guy.
Yeah.
So that's very valuable to have an opportunity to compare. But I wanted to sort of challenge, sort of clarify a little bit your very first example. I mean, the Iwo Jima monument versus, or not versus, T-34 monument. This is
good. This is good. I like this. Yes, some challenge.
Yeah. This is not basically the technology this monument is meant to symbolize. I think, and I'm pretty sure that this is this monument symbolizes not the technology, but the group of people, not the individual, but the group of people.
Yes.
And the best thing to symbolize the effort, the enormous effort, and that all the nation has put into this, the best thing is to use sort of that technology as a monument. So this is not the technology versus people. This is group versus individual, probably. And things starting to shift, I think, in the Eastern culture. I mean, in Eastern our country, our culture, but not that much yet, probably. This is clearly not a technology. Speaking your words, it doesn't resonate in me, but that group of people versus probably individual.
I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. It's not that the tech is tech. It's that the tech is it's a pinnacle of achievement as a collective. And I think, that really does go to a very important difference. You and I were talking about this a little bit yesterday, just out in the coffee break. As Westerners, there's an interesting thing. We're all, from birth, we're all special snowflakes. We're all told that we're meant to be the President of the United States or the CEO of our own company, or we're supposed to be, an astronaut or a fireman or something. Like, none of us are supposed to just, dig ditches, pull the lever in the factory to move things forward. Like, somehow we're all destined for greatness. And it's the best and worst part of that Western approach. And you're right, it is. In the West, we value teamwork, but we value it as each of us sort of subverting and subsuming our own egos and our own, we're all CEOs, to work on something together, but it's all about the individual pieces of the team rather than the team. And it is definitely a huge difference. The way that Westerners, you can fall into this trap and become depressed because, by the time you're 15, you're not the CEO of something, or running your own small country somewhere, or having been the governor by the time you're 26. I mean, the level of expectation on an individual can be really silly sometimes, frankly, and create some weird choices. But it leads to not just confidence, but frankly, a lot of times overconfidence in our own abilities. That's why we're perfectly willing not to plan, right? Because, we'll figure it out. I'm supposed to be the President of the United States. Of course I can figure this out, God, look at every movie, right? Every Hollywood movie is exactly that, right? Nobody's just your average bartender who kind of serves nice drinks to average people. No, man. You know, it's Tom Cruise who, you know, does this with the drinks and, you know, the shaker's going in the air. He's the best bartender ever. You know, it's that sort of pinnacle of achievement, that proto-human is kind of the, you know, this American dream idea. And you're right, it really is. It's individual as opposed to collective. So I like that. I think it's a good way to describe it. I think you're right.
Thank you, Zane, very much. It was a great talk. And next up will be Keith Fuller in 2 minutes.
Thank you.